When people first heard the phrase philosophy of science, they become puzzled and wondered, what does philosophy have to do with science? Well, the question is quite reasonable. Philosophy and science are often viewed as separate disciplines, but seemingly have a great deal with one another. When it comes to the philosophy of science, it may be difficult to define, but we may all agree that philosophy of science deals with philosophical and foundational problems that arise within science. On this definition, philosophy deals initially with the questions which science cannot yet or perhaps can never answer, and with the further questions of why science cannot answer these questions. These questions may be attempted to be answered using philosophical argument, and this makes philosophy unavoidable for scientists. Here, the relation between philosophy and science is so close that the philosophy of science became the central concern between both philosophers and also scientists. It is expected that the origins of modern science can be traced back to a period of rapid scientific development that occurred between the 15th and 17th century, which now we refer to as the Scientific Revolution. Since then, numerous prominent figures have emerged with their own theories in the field of philosophy of science. Hence, this video attempts to discuss further about the approaches to the philosophy of science by these two figures, Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn.
In this part, I will elaborate about Thomas Kuhn and his work on paradigm shift, also Karl Popper with his theory of falsification. First of all, I will give a brief introduction about Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Samuel Kuhn, or better known as Thomas Kuhn, was born on 18th July 1922 in Cincinnati, Ohio, United States. All of his works in philosophy of science took place in the era of 20th century. He was mainly interested in the field of history and philosophy of science, and that explains his achievement in obtaining a PhD degree in physics from Harvard University in the year of 1949. Out of all of his works in science, the most notable and influential work of his was his book entitled The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he introduced a term called paradigm shift. So, what is paradigm shift? According to Thomas Kuhn, paradigm shift is the progression of scientific knowledge always undergoes a periodic phase called paradigm shift. In this paradigm shift is where the new approaches, ideas and experiments comes to the understanding with what the scientists would have never thought valid before. So by saying this, Thomas Kuhn denies the fact that science is an objective criteria, but rather it always undergoes a process called paradigm shift towards its development and progression. So basically, this paradigm shift has four significant stages. The first stage is normal science. This normal science is characterized as a set of theories, new theories and ideas which can be used to explain what is possible or what is rational to do, where it becomes clear to the scientists with the tools available that can be used to approach certain problems. However, in certain circumstances, under the normal science, the paradigm shift undergoes anomalies where the existing paradigm could not give explanation towards the anomaly that occurs in that particular field. So there goes the presence of anomalies in the normal science. When enough significant anomalies occurred against a current paradigm, the scientific discipline will undergo a state called crisis. So in this state called crisis, what has considered as normal science could not be used anymore to solve a certain problem scientifically. So now the scientists have to work on the normal science to make it a better version or it is what Thomas Kuhn called as extraordinary research. The scientists engaged in the extraordinary research must come up with new experiments and theories that can explain the anomalies. So once a new paradigm is formed, it will be considered as the new normal science because it has the new and updated version of theories that can be applied to certain scientific problems. Thus, this new normal science or this new paradigm will be considered as the dominant one in that scientific field. So that is all for the paradigm shift. Now we will see the second philosopher, who is Karl Popper. Karl Popper was an Austrian-British philosopher, an academic and a social commentator. He was also one of the most influential philosophers of science. For Popper, the most important thing about science is that it is always critical. This is because scientists are always trying to show that their own theories are false. Scientists never claim that their theory is true because they know that there will be a new observations always existence in the circumstance that shows that their theory is wrong. So they are only interested in critically testing theories and showing that they are false. This is what Karl Popper called as a theory of falsification. For example, if I say vegetable needs to be stored in the refrigerator for it not to get spoiled, and then I left the vegetable outside of the refrigerator and it is not spoiled, my first statement will be falsified and I can no longer use the theory. So that is what he emphasized on the theory of falsification, as a newly presented theory can be denied with its fallacies and be replaced with a new theory, and it is an endless process. So that is all about Karl Popper and the theory of falsification.
For Karl Popper, science is always critical because scientists are always trying to falsify their own theories. Scientists never claim that a theory is true because they know that there could be a possibility that a new observation would show that their theory is wrong. So, they are only interested in critically testing the theories and proving that their theories are false. The only conclusion that they will derive is certain theory is false. Thus, this critical nature of science leads to refutation and constant changes in scientific theory. For example, Popper would think of an anomaly as an falsification, as it shows that the theories are wrong, so that we need to reject that theory and thus reject the whole paradigm. Furthermore, science goes into the process of self-correction. The mistakes that are made by scientists will be discovered through critical inquiry or criticism and also be corrected.
Farah, Kuhn does not agree with that idea. He contended that the idea of science is critical, as for him it is an illusion most of the time, and there are only specific and exceptional moments that science becomes critical. As a historian, he believes that we must look at science as it was really practiced. Thus, he focused more on normal science instead of an established paradigm. Besides, being too critical will hinder scientific discipline progress. For Kuhn, he opines that science is closed and dogmatic, whereby critical inquiry is not encouraged and scientific theories ought to be accepted without questions. For example, it is apparent in scientific education in high school or in our university, such as in our subjects physics, biology or chemistry. It is a dogmatic rather than a critical process where the student has to accept the truth of scientific theories and not criticize them. They need to accept whatever the teacher has taught them and passively accept the theories and never challenge the teacher.
Secondly, for Popper, theory change in science shows the rationality of science as it is viewed in the light of logic and philosophy. it is not a science of instability. Other than that, the rationality of scientific change can be explained in terms of falsification, where the theory choice made by scientists can be rationally justified. Therefore, scientists are rational to accept the new theory as it has new empirical evidence over the old theory. Besides, the new theory can explain the anomalies which were not solved in the previous theory. Conventionally, science is basically an attempt to formulate a knowledge through a scientific knowledge by utilizing empirical data and inductive logic. The aim of whole scientific inquiry is to prove the theory is true based on the empirical evidence. On the other hand, for Popper, he believes that no amount of empirical data is sufficient to claim a theory to be true. This is because the amount of relevant data could be potentially infinite. Therefore, we can easily prove a theory to be false just by one counterexample, but we cannot prove it to be true no matter how much evidence that we gathered or we have, because it is almost impossible. So this is known as a theory of falsification.
Secondly, for Kuhn, theory change in science is not determined by rational factors such as logical argument and empirical evidence. For him, theory change should be understood in terms of psychology, the idea of mental switch like Copernicus and sociology. The reason why new theories are accepted and old are abandoned is because the followers of the old theory simply are not found in the younger followers, as the old followers died. Then, for Kuhn, theory change is non-rational as it is not based on the logic or rationality. Decisions made by scientists are not always rational. For example, Copernicus, who follows Hermes in divinity of the sun.
Third, Popper's view of science is influenced more by revolutionary changes in science, such as the change from Newton's to Einstein's theory. It means that Popper aims to look at big changes on science, such as the scientific revolution.
Next, Kuhn focused more on normal science. For example, science as it usually or normally practiced, where paradigms guide the research or problem-solving process. Here, science is practiced under guided paradigm.
Lastly, for Popper, the development of science is a progression towards truth. Here, as the theory changes, more and more truths are discovered. For Popper, the aim of science is precisely to search for the truth. And for that, in spite of all the difficulties and limited successes, eventually, we will manage to approach to it. And Popper also asserts that to approach truth, it is generally not sufficient to correct the errors of the previous theory only. Instead, we need to develop a new theory that can solve the difficulties of the early one. So, this highlights the idea that scientific progress is made by means of a sequence of false theories which are moving closer to the truth. Let's take theory A and B for example. Both theories are false, whereby A can be considered as the early theory and B is the later one. So it states that B is closer to the truth than A if in the passage from A to B, its truth content increases and its falsity content decreases.
For Kuhn, the development of science only shows progress in terms of problem solving and not in terms of getting closer to the truth, because it focuses on searching for a new theory that works better for problems that the old theory cannot solve. As for Kuhn, the progress of science is radical and revolutionary in nature, where it is a vicious cycle. It is a process in which the existing normal science is fundamentally challenged by the new discovery of new facts which are incompatible with the existing methods, and thus beg new explanation which leads to formulation of new theory or paradigm, the phase of crisis within the scientific community. And that phase is followed by the contestation between new and old paradigm, in which the new paradigm comes out victorious, and thus establishment of new paradigm, which later becomes normal science. In other words, the progress of science for Kuhn is the story of paradigm shifts or scientific revolutions. A paradigm shift is a shift in perception or perspective, where a completely new perspective like Newton's law of physics or Einstein's relativity or quantum mechanics can appear. Kuhn points out that there is no neutral standard that we can use to assess which of the two paradigms is better, which he introduced incommensurability, there is lack of comparability using a neutral standard. In other words, they cannot be compared using the standard that is appropriate for both. We cannot say that a new paradigm is better than the old paradigm.
Through the video, it is apparent that Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper have contributed tremendously in the philosophy of science, and both have presented different ideas. For instance, Karl Popper proposed the theory of falsification, where he opines that scientific change shows the rationality of science, and that change implies progression towards the truth. Thomas Kuhn, on the other hand, introduced the model of structural development and argues that theory change is non-rational, but rather more of a shift in paradigm. The model of structural development by Kuhn is problematic. To reconcile with Popper's theory of falsification, as Kuhn's historical account about how scientists operate came into conflict with Popper's work. Nevertheless, we all agree that Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper approaches to science are indeed significant and necessary for the historical development of the philosophy of science. That's all from us. Thank you.